Despite all my rage, I'm just a snail in a maze. The real Segaiden begins here as the Master System arrives in America.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit.
A few years after entering the console market in Japan, Sega finally makes the international leap by coming to America. Rather than starting from square one, however, the company jumps straight ahead to the number 3, or that is, the Mark III.
As you know, America never saw the SG-1000, although the system fared reasonably well in Japan and at least had some presence in Europe and Australia. Several factors kept it isolated from what was, at the time, the largest market in the world. For starters, the American market as a whole may have been massive, but you couldn't say the same for the US games market at that point. The SG-1000 made its Japanese debut just as the American console business crashed in on itself, wiping an entire sector of video game audiences off the map for a few years. In those same few years, the SG-1000 saw its heyday in Japan, the years it could have potentially been a viable product in the West. By the time American retailers had licked their wounds and returned to the fight, the SG-1000's tech felt woefully out of date. Sega had its own concerns to deal with as well. In 1984, the company's parent group, American conglomerate Gulf and Western, began spinning off and selling many of its business divisions. That process began with Sega, whose fortunes had been hindered by that US games crash. And it took a year or two for the newly reliberated Sega to find steady footing internationally. Besides, Sega had never really had a proper international presence in video gaming to that point. Despite some strong coin-op successes in the US with cabinets like Pengo and Zaxxon, not to mention licensing a healthy lineup of titles to Coleco for home release on ColecoVision and Atari 2600, Sega had never established a full-scale amusement division in the US. Rather, Sega Electronics had largely relied on the help of partners for manufacturing and distribution, most notably the California-based Gremlin. The tides began to shift in 1985 when the fully independent and restructured Sega established Sega Enterprises USA and Sega of America, setting its sights on the American market. The company had a newfound sense of confidence, and understandably so. Not only could Sega finally call its own shots, it could enter the second half of the 1980s with a stunning new arcade lineup in the works, beginning with 1985's blisteringly fast motorcycle racer Hang-On and behind-the-shoulder scaling shooter Space Harrier. And on the home front, it could look to a massive upgrade to the SG-1000, so significantly it effectively counted as a new system, the Mark III. Meanwhile, while Sega spent a couple of years regrouping, Nintendo had been poking and prodding at US retail, eager to resuscitate any sort of interest for a Western release of its Famicom console. Corporate buyers recoiled at the sight of another video game console with the potential losses that represented, so the company decided to simply go it alone with a more grassroots approach. It shipped a limited selection of consoles and games to a handful of New York retail outlets for a small test launch whose stunning success demonstrated to retailers and media alike that American kids hadn't lost their appetite for console games, just for bad games and sloppy business practices. Nintendo prepared to go nationwide in the summer of 1986, and that renewed retail interest in video games gave Sega a perfect opportunity to sneak into their rival's slipstream and launch the Mark III in America around the same time. Sega's console felt every bit as next-gen as the Nintendo Entertainment System, if not more so. Its graphical tech actually outperformed Nintendo's, offering more colors and bigger sprites. It presented a unified front at retail, inverting the uniform look of Nintendo's branding with its own universal packaging style. Where Nintendo shipped games in black boxes emblazoned with faux pixel art and bold sans serif type, Sega commissioned ad agency J. Walter Thompson to create an Apple-inspired format. An elegant Roman serif typeface in deep blue atop a white field subtly lined with a metallic silver grid and accompanied by a simple, almost icon-like illustration to represent the contents of the game within. Although this look has become something of a running joke these days, that's an ahistoric view. In August 1986, when the Mark III arrived in America as the Master System, this format sat at the forward edge of consumer design. Walking into a store and witnessing an entire display of Master System products with their bold titles and minimalistic artwork gave you the sense that gaming's future had truly arrived. The uniformity of the packaging made the minor differences all the more intriguing, prompting you to clutch a box and flip it over to read the back cover copy and scan the screenshots. The Master System design motif did grow long in the tooth after a few years. It took a lot longer for Sega to move away from its grid and generic title text than it did for Nintendo to retire their black box look. And it certainly didn't help that Sega didn't open the platform to third-party publishers until around 1989, meaning every game box had the same first-party, in-house sensibility about it. To further muddle things, Sega eventually passed Master System distribution over to Tonka, a toy company that did a shockingly poor job of the whole thing. By the time Sega wrested the platform back, the damage had been done for the US. Then again, Sega had struggled with branding from the beginning.
For starters, Sega didn't actually call its console the Master System, at least not at first. Instead, the initial branding referred to it as the Sega System, and it shipped in two variants. The basic package, the Sega Base System, contained the console, hookups, and two controllers. But for those who wanted the more deluxe experience, Sega also offered the Sega Master System, which included all of that, plus the light phaser, plus a combo cartridge with 2 games on it.
With the Master System model, Sega challenged Nintendo's NES Deluxe set head-on, ditching the useless robot to keep things competitive, but that wasn't meant to be the console's formal name. Somewhere along the way, though, the Master System moniker stuck. In 1987, Sega folded the American console design back into the Japanese market as an upgrade to the Mark III, integrating the standalone FM sound unit into the hardware itself, and formally calling this release the Master System. By the time streamlined hardware revisions showed up in the West, Sega had simply defaulted to calling the console Master System, as seen in 1990's compact Master System 2.
Sega completely redesigned the Mark III for the West, essentially inverting its color scheme and streamlining its design to remove some of the superfluous details, as well as the IDE port and the controller docks. Although the American model generally kept the slim lines of the Mark III, it adopted a slightly raised, almost trapezoidal shape that gave it a bit more height, presciently avoiding the issues Nintendo would experience with the boxy NES, denying children flat surfaces on which to place electronics-destroying beverages.
Despite everything the Master System had going for it, Sega struggled to make proper headway into the US and Japanese markets. Nintendo had only a small lead on Sega in America in terms of time, yet the NES surged almost immediately to bestseller status, while the Master System trailed in a distant second place, ahead of Atari's aging, budget-priced consoles, but well behind the NES. And it fared even worse in Japan against the Famicom. Curiously though, Master System did become a bona fide hit in 2 other markets, Europe and Brazil. Although it launched in both territories well after it had made its American and Japanese debuts, Nintendo achieved very little traction in either region, having focused its efforts on its 2 primary markets on other continents. Europe and the UK had largely gravitated toward inexpensive microcomputers in the early 1980s, and those devices, like the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, had grown impossibly archaic by the latter portion of the decade. The arrival of a system with enthusiastic corporate backing, graphical capabilities to shame those early micros, and a price tag far friendlier than that of current gaming-focused computers like Atari ST and Commodore Amiga, well, suddenly an entire continent understood the appeal of console gaming for the first time, thanks to Master System. As for Brazil, Sega succeeded there by teaming up with a local company called Tectoy. Brazil's tariff laws reportedly made imported game hardware impossibly expensive for the average consumer. By working with Tectoy, Sega managed to bring its hardware to Brazil at a reasonable price by making it a local product, turning the Master System into a regional standard that continues to thrive even today. That said, Segaiden will strictly focus on the US market. The bulk of the Master System's library shipped exclusively in Europe and Brazil, and the time and cash investment that would be required to cover it all is well beyond my means. Over the coming months, I intend to bring Master System coverage up to date with my NES Works coverage, which currently sits at the end of 1988, and then move forward to discuss the remaining chronology of both systems in tandem. In terms of production, I plan to capture footage on real, if slightly ahistoric hardware whenever possible. I've had a Sega Mark III modded by iFix Retro to enable it to output RGB video while connected to an FM sound unit peripheral, something that's normally impossible. I'll be running American Master System carts and cards on this Japanese console with the help of a cartridge adapter to bypass the region lock. Sega programmed dozens of games with FM-enhanced audio, and they only removed that data from the localized versions of Phantasy Star and Ys. So if these games look and sound a little better than you remember, that's why. This may not be entirely accurate to history, but it will be more enjoyable for me personally. Now, the Mark III hardware won't work for all purposes. For example, Sega never released light gun games in Japan. The hardware doesn't actually support the light phaser accessory. For those titles, and, say, coverage of games that never received a cartridge release because they shipped as part of the console's BIOS, I'll record from an analog Mega SG and DAC, or a MiSTer. The American Master System ultimately saw a little more than 100 releases, and I intend to tackle them all, along with a dozen or so Mark III games that appeared exclusively in Japan. I'll probably track down some of the more interesting European exclusives too, like the OUTRUN sequel that never came to the US, or the Castlevania ripoff Master of Darkness that Americans only saw on Game Gear. Although Master System struggled in the US compared to the NES, it has an important place in video game history. Sega cut its console development teeth on SG-1000 and experienced its awkward puberty on Master System, which allowed the company to mature into the one that gave us the Genesis and Dreamcast. Sega made plenty of mistakes with Master System, but they learned from those errors, and they also did quite a bit right. The hardware itself impressed in 1986, with specs that rivaled the company's System 1 arcade board. The software library largely focused on Sega's own arcade hits, but it also offered plenty of great original titles by internal development teams and third-party studios. The Master System had its own distinct style. You'd never mistake these games for anything from a Nintendo or Atari. And just as the SG-1000's architecture lived on through the Mark III and Master System, the Master System's internals continued to live on inside the Genesis, and of course, the Game Gear. The American console even retained the Japanese card slot to support MyCard games, or Sega cards as the company called them here, while it dropped the IDE connector that powered the FM sound unit, and which allowed Japanese fans to continue using their SC3000 computer setup. The card slot allowed American fans not only to play budget software, but also to use the Sega 3D system glasses. And hey, you don't even have to plug in a cartridge or card to play a game on Master System.
Yes, Sega added an element to the US console that set it apart from other systems of its time. It included a free built-in game. Take that, Nintendo.
Where the NES would simply give you a screen flashing different colors if you failed to insert a cartridge, a function of the TIN-NES security chip failing to find the proper handshake data to complete startup, Master System simply displays a Sega logo when it doesn't detect a game. The console doesn't hang though, it can still detect inputs. And if you should happen to press up and buttons 1 and 2 at the same time while the console waits for you to plug in a cart, you'll activate a simple game that Sega coded into the system, Snail Maze. It's a game in which you guide a snail through a maze, so Snail Maze. Snail Maze challenges you to work your way through a series of 12 intricate mazes at a literal snail's pace. The developers managed to create some surprisingly dense designs here, with each wall of the maze consisting of a single pixel and passages barely wide enough for your tiny snail sprite to pass through. A graphical showcase this ain't, but what do you want from a freebie that consists of a few kilobytes of code? The mazes demand a lot of concentration, and their tight time limits sit at odds with the glacial pace of your on-screen avatar. Now, Snail Maze did not appear in the Mark III, and Sega would remove it from Master System 2 models, giving it a tiny window of exclusivity targeted toward American and European fans who jumped in early. Hardly a hunk of code to move the needle in Sega's favor, but a fun party trick.
Meanwhile, the actual pack-in game that people wanted to play with the Master System got a jump on Nintendo's combo carts by a couple of years. It's an action game and a light gun game together in a single cartridge. Hang On Safari Hunt is Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt several years in advance.
Where the NES Deluxe set shipped with a light gun or Robot 2 controllers and 2 cartridges, Sega bypassed the whole Rob nonsense altogether. Without the need to include a Gyromite-like title to support a marketing gimmick, Sega had the freedom to include more of a core action title along with its light gun game, Hang On. Now, I've already covered Hang On in the context of its Mark III release, and I don't have much more to say about it here. Where time and library differences often resulted in a disconnect between the Famicom and NES releases of many early Nintendo-published and licensed games, Hang On occupies the same place on Master System that it had on Mark III 9 months earlier. Namely, it presents players with a launch title. It's a kick-ass racing game with a sense of speed and graphical detail like nothing ever seen on any console before it. Hang On didn't so much announce Sega's arrival as kick down the door, grab you by the shoulders, and scream, "Sega is here!" Hang On, of course, shipped for the Sega Mark III as a Sega MyCard, whose small data storage capacity relative to cartridges probably accounts for the game's lack of music. That's a little tragic given that Hiroshi Kawaguchi's Hang On theme kicked off the Sega era of game music dominance, just as Hang On helped kick off the era of superscalar gaming. However, this woeful compromise did allow Sega to stuff the MyCard data onto a full-size cartridge alongside an entire other game, a light gun shooter called Safari Hunt. The title would suggest a sequel to early SG-1000 game Safari Hunting, though this sadly does not appear to be the case in practice. Once you get past the title screen and its deeply unfortunate visual imagery, Safari Hunt doesn't have much to do with Safari Hunting. It's not just that the SG-1000 title saw you stalking through a brush maze and involved a methodical game loop of making your way over to animals before shooting and dragging them to your vehicle, while the Master System release consists entirely of simple target galleries. Safari Hunt has a more violent premise, where the SG-1000 game had appeared in arcades under the name Tranquilizer gun and asked you to simply stun and capture creatures. You deal casual death in Safari Hunt and don't have to worry about cleaning up the corpses once you've shot a target. Now, granted, Safari Hunt takes a comical approach to all of this. It appears to be a direct response to Nintendo's Duck Hunt, which had debuted in Japan 2 years earlier and straight up involved slaughtering waterfowl. It even uses the same general setup. Animals appear, you have a set amount of ammo with which to shoot them. Once you run out of time or bullets, the game tallies your score, and if you've scored well enough, you can move along to the next scene. Most of the time, when you plug a critter here, it slinks off the screen with a cross-shaped bandage on its wounds, though not always. A clean hit reduces fish to horrified skeletons, causes monkeys to plunge from the trees to their doom, and utterly disintegrates spiders. Safari Hunting softened its premise of shooting at endangered wildlife by presenting players with the task of simply capture them to go live in a zoo or preserve or something, while Safari Hunt offers no such padding. It's just a game about depopulating the savanna and rainforest, but it doesn't have quite enough personality for everything to properly gel. Kinda makes you miss that stupid duck hunt dog. As target shooting games go, it works well enough and justifies the light phaser pack-in, though the game does become extremely tricky around stage 3, with quick animals and precise targeting required, making it extremely difficult to reach level 4. Sega would ultimately release about a dozen 8-bit light gun shooters, a couple of which shipped exclusively in Europe. So the light phaser ended up being about as useful as Nintendo's Zapper. And like Nintendo's gun, it didn't resemble a real weapon. Because it shipped exclusively in the American and European regions, where guns don't simply exist as inaccessible fantasy objects as they do in Japan, Sega differentiated their toy from a real weapon by styling it in a sci-fi mode that somewhat resembled a slimmed-down version of the Transformers Space Pistol Shockwave. Its sci-fi heritage would be canonized the following year when Sega collaborated with Tatsunoko to sponsor an anime called Zillion, in which the protagonist's galaxy-saving handgun looked exactly like the light phaser. Though curiously, the Zillion tie-in video game would end up taking the form of an Impossible Mission knockoff with no light gun support. As for Safari Hunt itself, it never shipped as a standalone cartridge or card, and never appeared in Japan. It did show up in 2 different combo carts in Europe, however, once with the Hang On and Safari Hunt combo cart, and once as a triple combo release with marksman shooting and trap shooting, which shipped sans Safari Hunt in the US. The real hero of the Master System package was Hang On, though. Although you'd see echoes of Safari Hunt's comical visual style throughout Sega's 8-bit lineup, Hang On spoke to the real strength of the console, technically unrivaled home conversions of Sega's arcade hits. When you consider that Nintendo had more or less abandoned developing games specifically for coin-op hardware as their focus after 1985's arm wrestling, and the sad fact that Atari Inc. wouldn't release a console platform with capables even close to the Master Systems for hosting Atari Games arcade masterpieces until 1989's Lynx, that gave Sega's platform a unique value proposition. Top arcade hits with fewer compromises and more faithful gameplay than the visually inadequate reinventions you saw on NES. It's a pretty compelling sales pitch in 1986, even if that pitch ultimately didn't appeal to everyone quite as much as, hey, you can play Mario here.
Next time on Segaiden, games sold separately.